very good evening. Welcome to On Teaching Racism. It is Tuesday, the 30th of November, 2021. Just gone 7:30 p.m. US Eastern Time. A special presentation produced by the Systemic Diversity and Inclusion Group with Dr. Joseph Nwoye and Mr. Yigal Kahana Esq, nonetheless. For those of you who are joining us here live, a very warm welcome. And for those of you that are listening to us on YouTube, likewise, a very warm welcome. And just a quick introduction of our two head-to-headers this evening. Mr. Yigal Kahana is a highly experienced lawyer of many years. He operated an English language and human rights program for Israeli, Ethiopian, and Arab high school students for 10 years. He now delivers online Zoom lectures for the Israeli police force, focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Head-to-head this evening with Dr. Joseph Nwoye, the current president of SDIG, the Systemic Diversity and Inclusion Group. He has served at various levels, including undergraduate and teaching at doctoral level, and in various administrative positions, including as Director of Urban Education and the Center for Multicultural Education at Illinois State University. It's lovely to have you with us. And I would like now to hand over to our first head-to-header this evening. A very warm welcome to Mr. Yigal Kahana.
Thank you, Mr. Adam. And good evening again, Joseph. How are you today?
I'm doing good, my friend. How are you?
Thank God. Can't complain. Can't complain. So we're here for our second in our series on unteaching racism. And before we began, I wanted to tell a story that I saw in the newspapers, online. No, online is the version of newspapers, of a very nice story that ties in with our subject matter, which is the texting mix-up that sparked the Thanksgiving tradition that's continued now for 7 years. That is that in 2016, a fellow named Jamal Hinton, who was 17 years old at the time, received a text message from a grandmother inviting him over for Thanksgiving dinner. The thing is, it wasn't his grandmother. A lady named Wanda Dench hadn't realized that one of her grandsons had changed his phone number, and Hinton instead received her text because I guess he got the number. When it became clear that Dench was not his grandmother, he asked if he could still attend the holiday dinner in her home at Mesa, Arizona. So she said yes, because that's what grandmas do, feed people. And so they had Thanksgiving dinner that year together, and have had Thanksgiving dinner since then every year, which has been 6 years. And this is a photo of, hopefully it will come out, of Jamal and Wanda. I thought this is a wonderful story of people who were not paying attention to racial thinking in their decision making. This ties in with our subject because our goal in creating this series was to work towards eliminating racism. And we need to make it clear to everyone, I think, over and over again apparently, that we recognize the great harm that racism has caused and continues to cause to the people in our society. We also see that racial discrimination flows from racial thinking. In other words, the idea that people are white or black or yellow or red. Racial thinking is not natural. Nobody is born with racial ideas in their head. Those ideas have to be taught to get into people's heads. And that idea is clearly expressed in this video from 1958, the musical South Pacific by Rodgers and Hammerstein.
The National Conference of Christians and Jews have the help of Richard Rodgers at the piano and Oscar Hammerstein in setting the mood of Brotherhood Week with one of their famous tunes.
In the second act of South Pacific, a young American Navy nurse explaining her prejudice says, "I can't help this. This is emotional. It's born in me." And the second character, the man who is losing her because of this prejudice, shouts his protest. "I do not believe this. I do not believe these things are born in you." And a third character, a young Marine lieutenant, played by my friend here, Bill Tabbert, says,
"It's not born in you. It happens after you're born. You've got to be taught to hate and fear. You've got to be taught from year to year. It's got to be drummed in your dear little ear. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are oddly made, and people whose skin is a different shade. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people your relatives hate. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be carefully taught.
Thank you so much. That actually pinpoints the type of things we are dealing with today. You got to be taught. You got to be taught carefully. We know that we are coming from various communities, urban, rural, and suburban. We love our parents, our brothers and sisters, our neighbors, and along that line. They taught us. And through that teaching, we learn. And sometimes, as they said, by the time we come to school, it's too late. And that explains why we have what we have. But for this particular section, as you have seen, there has been progress. When you look at the military in 1948, when the military was united, but even at then, there were so many divisions. A famous writer, scholar, epitome of scholar at the time of his time, W. Du Bois, asserted in 1903 in his famous book, The Souls of Black Folks. He asserted that, I quote, "The problem of 21st century is the problem of color line." Folks, that was 100.
the problem of the 20th century.
Right, you're right. And that we are now in 21st century. It has been 120 years since that, the time he made those points or remarks. To be clear, there has been great progress since that time. We look at integration in the Army, as I said. Look at civil rights work we've done, where we've gotten to. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I won't lie to you. We are in 2021. We still have evidence of those racism. Sometimes when I hear my students send me videotapes of what is happening in their various schools, it's raw. And keep in mind that these are people who are professionals, people who've been trained well, provided all kind of certifications, with the hope that they're gonna do well. Ladies and gentlemen, in spite of all these efforts, we still see a lot of problems. Discrimination still persists. But these discriminations, as my friend Yigal would say, stems from racial thinking. And he's of the view that we need to eradicate racial thinking. And to eradicate racial thinking, we have to go to the root cause of what propel people to think racially. And as I alluded to, our dad and mom and the people we love, we deny it in public, but that's what happens in private. A famous professor I love wrote about how when she was young, the parents had two faces, the public face and the private face at home. When they came to public, she would be asked to be friendly, be nice. When she went home, she was made to know that she's not supposed to mingle with certain member of the public because of their race. A little girl, that was a great burden on her, but she had to go through those things. This is why we are doing this. We wanna eradicate whatever will constitute to training people to think racially. And that's why we came to this series we call On Teaching Racism. We see that the idea of race is still being taught. And as Baron Mopik wrote in his classic Spirit of the Law, before we instruct, we must begin by undeceiving. In other words, be truthful, don't deceive yourself, which is what those teachers I mentioned went through, which is what my friend, one of the eminent scholars today, went through. She wrote it in an article that we read during my doctoral dissertation. And up to date, I will never forget that. So it's on this that we came to the point that we have to really unteach those things through the practices we've initiated. So to this, I would like us to listen to the music or video where Montesquieu asserted that all these things.
Montesquieu, Joseph.
Montesquieu, so that we can unteach racism and hopefully create a better tomorrow.
You may think you know exactly what race you are, but how would you prove it if someone disagreed with you? The fact is, even though race drives a lot of social and political outcomes, race isn't real. One of the first people to attempt to categorize humans according to race was a German scientist around 1776. He came up with 5 different groups according to physical appearance and geographic origin of their ancestors. Americans of European descent eagerly bought into this type of thinking around the same time. Some historians have said the idea that there were different races helped them resolve the contradiction between a natural right to freedom and the fact of slavery. If whites were their own distinct category, then they could feel a lot better about denying freedom to people who they labeled black and decided were fundamentally different. But as political priorities change, definitions of race in America adjust right along with them. For example, if you were of Mexican birth or ancestry in the United States in 1929, you were considered white. Then the 1930 census changed that to non-white to limit immigration. Later, when the US needed to increase its labor force during World War II, these people were switched back to white. And what it took to be black once varied so wildly throughout the country, from 1/4 to 1/16 to the infamous one drop of African ancestry, that people could actually change races just by crossing state lines. Then, suddenly, in 2000, the government decided that Americans could be more than one race and added a multiracial category to the census. This has left many Americans scratching their heads when it comes to selecting who they are. As many as 6.2% of census respondents selected some other race in a 2010 survey. The idea that someone might look one way and identify another way, or that they might be really hard to place in a racial category, is not new. This is why there was a public debate about whether MSNBC's Karen Finney could say she was black, or how we can't even agree on the racial label assigned to the President of the United States. Of course, many people feel their racial identity is very clear and very permanent, but the fact that some people have changed theirs and that no one can really argue with them shows how shaky the very idea of race is. This is all because there isn't a race chromosome in our DNA that people can point to. It simply doesn't exist. When the medical community links race to health outcomes, it's really just using race as a substitute for other factors, such as where your ancestors came from, or the experiences of people who may have been put in the same racial group as you. Dorothy Roberts explains that sickle cell anemia is a prime example of this. The disease is linked to areas with high rates of malaria, which include some parts of Europe and Asia in addition to Africa. It's not actually about race at all. This, of course, does not mean that the concept of race isn't hugely important in our lives. The racial categories to which we're assigned can determine real-life experiences, they can drive political outcomes, and they can even make the difference between life and death. But understanding that racial categories are made up can give us an important perspective on where racism came from in the first place.
So, Joseph, that video illustrates pretty well how unreal the idea of race is. And it's pretty widely known by now that racial constructs do not match genetic realities, and there's no scientific basis to justify racial classifications. On the contrary, as far as science is concerned, there's only one objective race, the human race. In order to believe otherwise, people have to be taught, the point of the previous video, that race is real, and to think in terms of racial categories like black and white and yellow and red. The problem is that video, besides for contradicting itself in a few ways, doesn't explain how to eliminate racism. It says racism is wrong. It says race is not real, but okay, but the fact is people are thinking that way, which led to the contradictions in that video. And how do we change the mindset of people to not think in terms of race, which is where our mission comes from. In order to eliminate racism, we recognize that where racial thinking has been taught, it must be untaught. And where education begins in the nursery schools and kindergartens, it should not be taught at all, to avoid the need for unteaching it later. To be really clear, what we're talking about here is stopping people from identifying themselves in terms of black and white, or red and yellow. In the last episode, we noted that racism cannot be eliminated as long as people keep thinking and using racial terms like black and white. It is possible to go through your day without ever calling anyone black or white. The fact is, in this society, in this day and age, it's not easy, but it's possible. And if we ever want to see racism eliminated, it's also necessary. In this book, The Soul of Black Folk by Webb Du Bois makes a very important point. He says, because, right, Joseph, some people are going to say, well, how can you tell people not to identify as black and white, right? We're so used to doing it. part of who we are already. And Dubois says the way to truth and right lies in straightforward honesty, not in indiscriminate flattery, in taking advantage of the opportunities at hand and urging their fellows to do the same, but at the same time, in remembering that only a firm adherence to the higher ideals and aspirations will ever keep those ideals within the realm of possibility. Despite the difficulties, if we want to get to a point where there is no racism, we have to scale the mountain of eliminating racial thinking. Dubois then calls color discrimination barbarism. We'll just finish the quote, then I want to hear, you can make your comments. It is wrong to encourage a man or people in evil doing. It is wrong to aid and abet a national crime simply because it is unpopular not to do so. We have no right to sit silently by while the inevitable seeds are sown for the harvest of disaster to our children. I think that sums it up really well. You, Joseph?
Well, I completely agree with that vision to eliminate racism. The fact is that we are seeing it even as we speak today in politics, where people are deciding to stop people from voting, in some cases because of their races. We have school teachers who are prepared to teach. The fact is that when they go to classroom, they behave in a way that is not consistent with those beautiful words you indicated, the high ideals. Socrates would be happy to hear those type of things. Would like to hear the questioning, asking questions, probing to get to the truth. So I do agree with these things, and I do believe that we have to keep striving to unteach racism, the concept that you brought that I think I embrace. The question, though, is how do we even get leaders to recognize what they do? That whether they know it or not, what they're doing is to fueling that division, racism, all those type of things. And I know when you told me that you're gonna have our participants to pledge, I love that. My only concern is it gonna be real? How can we make it real? I see your articulation of what you would want, the ideal world. But the reality is that we have human beings with all kinds of behaviors that could lead to actually what we want to do. And as I've always tried to sum up, for everything we see or do in life, if regardless of how difficult, how horrible, say for instance, this COVID, if you look deeper and broader, you find something good out of it. So my view is that this program we just begin, we're just warming up. I do believe that we'll take it to a height where more and more people will begin to understand, to see why we're gonna move to eradicate racism in all its forms. The science has proven that human beings are 99.9, I believe, I can't remember the last fractions, are the same. And yet, we see all kinds of people advancing all kinds of things to divide. And it's tough. But we're gonna continue to do the things we are trying to do to unteach racism, because we do believe that's the right course and that's where we're going.
And just to add on that, if anybody has another idea of how to racism other than or beyond the simple elegant solution of stopping to call people black and white, I would love to hear it.
Let me add to this. Nancy, I want to thank you for the job you are doing. I wish I can replicate people with your character, with the premises with which you write the book, the purpose with which you write the book. Replicate such across the board. Policymakers, politicians, medical professionals, educators, bankers, or whatever dimension you want to think about. Unfortunately, that's ideal. We live not in so ideal world. I have had my quarrel with my friend, Yigal, because when he talked about these ambitious, wonderful ideas, I embraced it, but kind of wondered, how about people who are in pain? What about people who will see racism instantaneously, see it right here and now? How would they feel? That image, if you want to talk about, like Reagan, who would say in the hill, the house in the hill, used to as illustration. Some people don't see it. So the question becomes, how can we replicate people like Nancy? I see my friend here, Kelly. How can we replicate people with good heart, with good mind, with purposes of changing the world for better, elevate us to that ideal place?
I think that's what we're here for, Joseph, is to, by spreading this idea around that there's one race, human, and everything else is just an illusion, even a psychosis of thinking that there's different races. And little by little, person by person, we build a movement of people who've taken the pledge that they're not going to use the word race in that way. And they're not going to refer to each other or themselves as black and white anymore, because that's ideological ground too valuable to give up, that we are all human beings.
I think that's a good point. And I might also add to that, there's a lady that teaches at Columbia. I read her article a couple of days ago. I can't remember her name. And the tenant of the article is this: when minority are asked to tell the story of their pains, their struggle, their suffering, that we are actually sort of re-traumatizing them to tell that story. But the thing is that, again, as I said, everything has both ends if we look deeper. The story will enable people who were not aware of the experience to become aware of the experiences. Example would be, if you think of George Floyd. When George Floyd died, I think he gave the world a new window to see what a lot of Black people had always complained about. And they also ushered a new view and commitment of so many that would otherwise stay on the sideline. And that resulted to pushing Congress to come up with something that will work, even though I do believe that legislations cannot bring morality. But it may be what we have. Unfortunately, Congress didn't do anything about it. So we have to figure, how can we all continue to push forward to get to that ideal place? Ideal place that, quite frankly, I think everybody want to be there.
You had a nice idea today, Joseph. You said if you see somebody acting in a way that shows some sort of racial bias, speak up, push back, object, right? And my suggestion was get people to practice going a day, 2 days, a week, a month, a year, the rest of their lives without calling anybody black or white, but thinking of anybody as a different race from themselves, but embracing, identifying with each other all as fellow human beings. And if that's the end goal, as Dubois says, as long as we keep that as our end goal, we're keeping it within the realm of the possible. If we don't keep that as our end goal, we don't even have it in the realm of the possible. And all we can do is legislate a little bit over here, and a new fire breaks out over there. And then legislate over there, and a new fire breaks out over here. And we end not solving the problem. So we need a holistic solution, which is hopefully building a movement of training people, of explaining to people not to think in racial terms. And once people are not thinking in racial terms, I really believe they won't act in racial terms.
I think that's a very important point that you brought up, Mr. Kahana. And I was also talking about what happened in Georgia, where the father and son and their neighbor murdered a black man. And if you were not the videotape, probably nobody would talk about it. But with the videotape, ushered in a new search. And when that one went through, we began to talk about the juries. Again, the selection of jury in a 63% black community, they could not get more than one black jurist. So at the end of during the process, I read a lot of things. I saw a lot of people talking about this, that these people were gonna let free. So those people, those jurors that were selected, mostly white, they epitomized what you were saying about the book. They tried to uphold the integrity, uphold the law, uphold things that some people who had seen pains, lies, inconsistencies, never believed. That's a way to really buttress what we are thinking. That's a way to instill that humanity, that people would stand and be at that highest level in their decision making, do this right thing. So I think that the integration of all these would be helpful as we move forward. We're not gonna say that these things are not happening, but I think if elimination of the name would be good, will push us in the right direction. In fact, this writer was saying that by using the term race, black or white, what we are really doing is that we are creating more pain, because the person that suffer as a result of it, or the person who does the victimization, there are certain degrees of pains each and every one of them have to absorb. But if we go the route we are talking about, not calling people by name, because by mere calling that leads to some other aspects, and it's I'm being warned that we have to end, I believe. So I'm gonna take it back to you, and then have you complete however you want to complete.
Nancy just said a great thing. She said, instead of saying races, she said various expressions of the human race. I think that's a nice, elegant solution to the terminology problem of talking about different races. Instead of talking about different races, talk about different expressions of the human race. That's like I said, that's elegant. I like it.
All right, that's good. Excellent.
See, there we made a little progress right here.
Well, I do believe that. I do believe that. Thank you, Nancy.
Mr. Kahana and Dr. Nwoye, you have provided us with a fantastic onward trajectory into your series on teaching racism. For the live broadcast, we will be ending here with a little music that may bring this to a hiatus, not a conclusion. And in the case that Nancy or Kelly would like to stay with us for a little while longer, then do feel free. This is something that I think, with which I think we can all, or to which I think we can all hopefully relate. This has been On Teaching Racism, another in the series by Mr. Yigal Kahana Esq and Dr. Joseph Nwoye. In the meantime, thank you for being with us, and this is One Love. On Teaching Racism, a series brought to you by Mr. Yigal Kahana Esq and Dr. Joseph Nwoye of the Systemic Diversity and Inclusion Group, every Tuesday at 7:30 p.m. US Eastern Time. If you'd like to find out more about the Systemic Diversity and Inclusion Group, then just do visit us at www.systemicdiversity.org. We'll see you next week.
So shall it be in the end.
Kahana, good choice of song.